My name is Smaro Camburelli. I'm professor and the Avi Bennett Chair in Canadian Literature at the University of Toronto, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here. It's a real honor to introduce Roy Miki and to have the opportunity to dialogue with him today. For most Canadians, Roy Miki is the kind of author and intellectual who doesn't need an introduction. He's had a remarkable career. He's the author of 5 poetry books, one of which, Surrender, won the Governor General's Award for Poetry in 2001. He is Professor Emeritus at Simon Fraser University here up the mountain. His first scholarly publication was the Pre-Poetics of William Carlos Williams, Cora in Hell, that came out in 1983, a book that announces his ongoing preoccupation with poetics, a poetics that invariably engages with how language and creative form move beyond the trap of inherited conventions to mediate the crisis that the subject that shapes subjectivity. He has contributed chapters to numerous critical collections and shared his poetry and lectured widely around the world. The editor of 8 books, in fact, he's had an illustrious career as an editor. He has also published 2 seminal collections of critical essays. The first one, Broken Entries, Race, Subjectivity Writing, that came out in 1998, was an instrumental collection in terms of establishing the formation of Asian Canadian literature. And the most recent collection of essays is called Influx, Transnational Shifts in Asian Canadian Writing, that I had the pleasure to edit, actually, and which appeared in 2011. His other publications include Redress, Inside the Japanese Canadian Justice, or Call for Justice, that came out in 2004, and which offers an insider's view of the Japanese Canadian redress movement that Roy Miki, along with his brother Art Miki, were instrumental in leading. Over the course of his long career, he's amassed more honors than I have the time to mention today, including the Order of Canada. This kind of citation, however, doesn't do justice to his major accomplishments and the range of his influence in different contexts and in different constituencies. So I would like now to turn to Roy, and I want to thank you, Roy, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
Every time I have the opportunity to introduce you, I feel that I have to resort to the trope of the list, and a good old epic trope. You're poet, critic, academic, bibliographer, influential teacher, editor of essays, poetics, founder and editor of a literary and critical journal, memoirist, cultural historian, activist, community builder, more recently a maker of photo collages, and just a month ago, you published your first children's book, which you co-authored with your wife, Slavia. Have I forgotten anything?
I hope so.
So I think that this speaks to the range of your incredible career. Someone with both prairie origins and Japanese-Canadian origins, but who is deeply rooted in Vancouver. And I hope you forgive me if I start with a rather conventional, albeit highly charged question about origins, more specifically the origin of memories. In one of your earlier poems, you write, "I was born under a sugar beet leaf. Believe me, memory was already daft. In the acute care ward of my childhood, the breaks were stunning." Would you like to take us back to that sugar field and start with that kind of memory?
Perhaps, thank you very much, Smaro, for inviting me to take part in this dialogue and conversation. And I feel very privileged and honored to be able to insert myself somehow into this MLA conference that's come to Canada for the first time, I think, in 17 years. And I was trying to think of what's the first, and I think this might be the very first time I'm appearing as a Canadian writer. That's meant to be humorous to a certain extent, and ironic, because it's very difficult in Canada, the history that I've come out of, from the origins in the sugar beet fields of St. Agathe and then around St. Agathe, to be introduced as a Canadian specimen. A specimen of what Canadian writing is all about. And I say this very thoughtfully because from very early on in my life, I've had a very difficult time with the whole concept of memory and writing that depends on the play of memory or the injunction of memory or the conjuring of memory. And so much of creativity and literary creativity is based upon the sites of memory out of which our subjectivities have been formed. But one of the things that's much more difficult is when the sites of memory are contested in early childhood, so that it's very difficult to tell that when you are constructing a memory and remembering something, whether you are actually being drawn out of a particular memory and into a constructed memory based upon various conditions that were functioning to limit your subjectivity at any given moment in your childhood. And so I grew up wondering, did I remember that? Or was I told this? Or did I make it up? A lot of things that I thought I remembered, I asked my mother about, and she said, no, that never happened. I said, but I have a distinct memory of horses going down the street in Alexander Street. She said, you're wrong. There were no horses ever when you were in your childhood.
So you invented some of your memories?
No, I thought for a long time that my parents were telling me the truth, and then I realized as time went on that they didn't remember. And sometimes my brothers, too, we would check memory, and they would tell me, that didn't happen, Roy. And I'd go back and think about it and ponder it and ponder it and ponder it. I said, did I make that up? And I realized that they didn't remember. Mm-hmm. So I would go back to them and say, you guys didn't remember. You guys weren't paying attention to what was going on in our family lives. So from early on in my life, myself bifurcated quite playfully sometimes and quite seriously other times. And I realized that there was a particular kind of identity that was constructed out of the responses that the social world, meaning my teachers and friends and everything, had to the signs that my body made as it walked down the street or as it spoke up in the classroom. And as I was announced as a Japanese, I was usually announced as a Japanese, not a Japanese Canadian. I don't know where the Canadian came from. Later on it became Japanese Canadian, but when I was growing up we were still considered Japanese. And I would think about these things and think that there was the self that was being made, socially constructed. And it was a very real self. I mean, it was a self that I took outside and I played baseball, hockey, had social affairs with people in the neighborhood and so on. And it was an absolutely real self. I'm not saying it was invented, but it was an absolutely real self that I used to get along with. But at the same time, there was another self that was tied more to the body, more to the confines of the home, the bodily relationships that I had with the members of my family, my grandparents' presence, my grandmother's presence, the Japanese language, which was only spoken in the home and that I used until I was 11 years old. And that disappeared by the time I was 15. That's kind of a shocking disappearance, but I think the weight of social conditioning comes in and the weight of erasure is operative there. But I was always conscious of this other body. And so much of it was tied to the experience that my family had of internment. And so my parents often said to me, any problem I had, which was okay when I was a teenager and got into trouble with various authorities, they would always say, that's the internment. I said, that's the internment. That's right, that's the internment. So much of my childhood, when I got into trouble, I could often say, that's the internment. And so my family used to call me the internment kid.
So it became an alibi for
It became an alibi to do whatever I want, actually. Basically, I was left alone as a child. My parents were not neglectful. They were wonderful parents, but they never hovered over me at all. And so as a result of it, I wandered the streets when I was very young. I had a bicycle and I would go all over Winnipeg. And it was during one of my many trips that I had that epiphany of this double self. And I realized, oh, I see. There's two things going on here. And the one that resided in my body was much more difficult to deal with. It had desires and it had things it wanted to do, but the other self couldn't do them. And I tried all kinds of various mechanisms to do things, and it was always very difficult. And the narratives of internment were both a burden, and as I realize today, they are the gift of my childhood.
I'd like to take you to a specific moment very early in the book, Redress,
okay.
where you refer to a family album, a photo album that the family left for safekeeping with some neighbors when they were dislocated and dispossessed. And the album eventually got lost because it was sold in an auction. And you say somewhere in Redress that although you never saw those photos ever, that became part of your childhood mythos. And I was fascinated by the statement because the mythos is based on something that is absent. And so I wonder whether you can talk a bit about that.
Well, the memory of those places that would have been maybe located in photographs, and I would have had some access to the stories around those photographs, were replaced by conversations and stories told by my grandmother and my grandfather. Not my grandfather, he died when I was too young, but my grandmother. And my mother's stories. There's a lot of mythological stories of my grandparents in Prince Rupert. My grandfather lived in Haida Gwaii for a few years. My mother lived there. She was born in Port Essington, grew up in Prince Rupert.
That's on your mother's or father's side?
Yeah, my mother's side. So there were a lot of family stories with origins in that part of BC that I haven't been able to recover through photographs. I went up there and did a bit of private research on those areas and got a sense of what it must have been like for my parents, my mother especially, as she was growing up there.
So those photos were lost, but there is one photograph that keeps appearing in your writing, in your critical writing, in your photo collages, in your poetry. And I'm referring to the image of a family photo that is located in Saint Agathe. And what I find fascinating about this particular image is that you're obsessed with it at the same time that, again, you are not there, but you are there because the three kids you see in the photograph are Roy's elder siblings. It's his mother. His mother and a family friend. But the thing is that Roy is not there, except that his mother is pregnant with him. And so I'm interested in hearing you talk about why this photo has such a gravity for you, at least in your creative and in your critical work. It keeps being recycled.
It's the thing about the daftness of memory, because I was born in Winnipeg, in the Winnipeg General Hospital. But my parents were relocated and interned in a beet field in St. Agathe. My mother got an RCMP pass to go have me in the hospital, and then came back to St. Agathe with me. So I think I should have been born in St. Agathe, but the regulatory system says I was born in Winnipeg. So that means forever and forever. When I said, people say, where were you born? I have to say Winnipeg. I can't say I was born in St. Agathe. But actually, I was not physically, I think. Somatically, I originated in St. Agathe, but the official record has me born in Winnipeg. So you got this dichotomy between the socially constructed self, which will get replayed over and over and over in biographical details, with the somatic self, which resides in this location, this place, where I imagine myself absorbing the environment of St. Agathe through my mother's womb. So I imagine myself in the pre-birth state as actually absorbing the dislocation and the internment at that early stage. And her anxieties maybe become my anxieties. And I was born I was literally, in that sense, born into the internment process.
Earlier you mentioned that you were exposed to Japanese, the Japanese were spoken in the family until about you were around 15 years
Around
old.
11.
11. And in your first poetry book, Saving Face, you have a poem where you say, lost in a Tokyo language school, and the poem situates you as a foreigner in a classroom together with an Australian, a Frenchman, a German, learning Japanese. What does it mean? What did it feel like being schooled in a language that is supposed to be your mother tongue? What kind of identifications and disidentifications take place in that kind of process?
I've pondered that for the most of my life, and especially when I'm writing poetry. Because I left Canada after I got my MA at Simon Fraser in '69, and Slavia and I bought a one-way ticket, sold everything. We decided we were going to go relocate to Japan. Had no idea why we were doing that. I thought I was going to become Japanese. So we said, let's give it 10 years and see what happens. I was going to get my MA degree in Japanese studies in Tokyo. It all worked out. The grand plans totally unraveled in 16 months. But when I was studying Japanese in this language school, I started dreaming. For the first time since I was a kid, I started dreaming in Japanese. And it was primarily through my grandmother's voice. And this led me to understand that the residues of first languages, mother tongue, that get lost, the residues of them still resonate in the body. There's body memory of the voices and of certain key words and certain key situations. And that helped me enormously in writing poetry, because I drew on that rhythmical sensibility in composing poems. It freed me actually from grammar and the regulatory system called the English language, and it helped me liberate myself from those particular kinds of restrictions.
That's interesting, because the book, the same book, Saving Face, is the first volume of poetry. But to me, it's quite interesting, if not strange, that it is really selected. It's poems 1969 to 76. Can you talk about the composition of your first poetry book, why it's posited as a selected?
Oh, to make a really long story short, I wrote a lot when I was a teenager. And
when did you start writing, approximately?
15, 16, somewhere in there. I thought seriously of being a poet when I was about 20. And I worked so earnestly at my poems. And I realized, it was in Japan, I realized it's all a pile of crap. It just didn't make sense to me. What was I doing? I actually had no self. I was writing a poem that was prescribed by some notion of the literary tradition that I had in my mind. And I was trapped by that I inside that literary tradition. So I thought I had made the major mistake that I'm really not a poet. I'm actually a critic. So I thought, I'll devote my life now to criticism. So I came back here and started work on my PhD. But as the 70s went on, and I was working away at a photo history project with Japanese Canadians, I used to take out and look at my grandparents' registration cards, because that's all I had left. And when I left home, I asked my mother if I could take, she had them in her possession. I said, could I take the registration cards of my grandparents, because they were so close to me? She said, yeah, go ahead, take them. So I still have them, and I would look at them. And one day I was looking at them, and I started writing a sequence of things. And I shut them, I put them in a drawer. And I said, what's that voice? I don't know what that voice is. I know it's dangerous, whatever it is. It's not mine. So I left it. But I got involved in the redress movement. And I don't know if those of you who have been in social movements, you know that your language, it has to be generative, but at the same time it has to be consistent. And you have to develop a particular kind of resistance voice, oppositional voice. So you develop rhetorical strategies to strengthen that position, that voice. But after a while, this kind of voice hardens. And it becomes literally the way you think. And it takes over the thought patterns in your mind. So that even though you become a more powerful voice of the movement, at the same time, the range of your intellectualizing is being restricted more and more. And I was exhausted when we were doing the redress movement. And I used to, when I sit on the plane, I would go, oh, this is so heavenly, just to sit on this plane. And I started writing notes of things throughout the 80s until the movement was over. And after it was over...
Critical notes or poems?
Poems.
Poems.
Yeah, they were lines.
Lines.
That you could identify as poems. And after this, we settled in 88, I guess I was looking, and I started looking at this notebook, and I realized that those were poems. So I just typed them up. And that became the manuscript of Saving Face.
Okay. You mentioned the influence of your grandparents. And I think in the context of what you just said, it's interesting that Broken Entries, your first collection of essays, is dedicated to your grandparents. And you say in the dedication, to my maternal grandparents whose imagined lives became visible inside the writing.
Yeah.
What I find compelling about this articulation is the coming together of the visible and the invisible and the articulable. And that makes me think about some of the ways in which Deleuze, for example, talks about Michel Foucault's work. So what I find in your work, both in the critical body of your writing and in your poetry, is this kind of interesting dialogue between, but also a conflict between the visible, invisible, and the articulable, and what still wants to enter language, but it just hasn't quite gone through that threshold. So can you talk about this tension? Because we see it even more pronounced in different ways in your photo collages.
Yeah, I don't know. I've always been fascinated by, and Jeff Dirksen and I have talked about this in the past, about Stuart Hall's notion of articulation and this idea of putting pieces together. Seeing how something functions by seeing its working parts. Social systems, regulatory, grammar at first from the school days and stuff like that. And you learn that through piecing things together, that so many things are pieced together and constructed. And if you can see how the parts work and things like that, you can see where the systems of power and how they operate. So as an analytical mode, it was very useful to me. But at the same time, I also realized that what gets to be called in Jacques Rancière's the regime of visibility is laden with power relations, and what becomes visible is dependent on what remains invisible. And for Japanese Canadian history, for redress movement, a part of our effort was to make visible a particular articulation of that history that we didn't feel was available in public domain.
Is this one reason why in a lot of your recent poetry books you have photographs, archival photographs, family photographs, and beginning with Mannequin Rising and There, your most recent poetry title, the visual images are your own photo collages, so you kind of take over, as it were, the authorship of the image in an interesting way. Okay. Although the image is being a photo collage, it still echoes all kinds of other voices and intertexts and histories and memory sites. Yeah. So if you can talk a bit about the use of the visual and the linguistic, whether they complement each other.
That was really important for me when I retired from the university. One of the things I was shocked by when I was sitting in my study, no longer having to prepare classes and
or mark papers.
Do all those kinds of nasty things that academics do to use up their useful time. I realized how saturated my consciousness had been by the written word, and that the image, which had been so dominant in so many forms in my life, had somehow escaped me, and I hadn't paid enough attention to the production of images. And so I decided to become a photographer, amateur photographer. And I loved the notion of Photoshop, so I thought, well, why don't I try constructing texts out of photographs? And since I can't draw worth hell, I'm useless as an artist. I can work on a computer and learn how to use Photoshop. Layering allowed me that flexibility and the possibility of creating visual collages.
But your interest in the visual and photography doesn't quite go or start with your retirement as you narrativized it.
Oh, no.
From my early memories of you is always being behind a camera or carrying a camera. Whether you were in a literary event, whether you were walking down the street or visiting friends or traveling as a tourist, and we had the chance to travel together quite a few times, you always see the world more often than not through the lens of the camera. So I see a certain kind of documentation impulse there, besides the desire to switch modes and employ a different kind of aesthetic mode or formal mode. So how does the documentary, historical, if you want, impulse come together with the aesthetic?
That's a difficult one. It's pretty complicated. I was for many years obsessed with documenting anything I could document. Photographs, tapes. I document every reading at Simon Ferris. I would give Curtis Fennell, who was a sound editor there. We worked on sound tapes for endless hours. And any writer who came to Simon Fraser took them into Curtis's studio, and we recorded them and so on. I don't know, that may have come from, that may have been the internment. Everything is the internment. Because of the lack of documentation of our own community's history. And Japanese Canadians weren't allowed by law to own cameras. They weren't allowed by law to take photographs of each other. And as a result, there was no documentation in the internment camps, unless if somebody's stolen the camera and brought it in and so on. But people didn't do that. So there's very little documentation by Japanese Canadians of the internment itself. And there's a lot of these absences in our history, and it may have come out of that. And also, my interest in the archives has to do with looking at the underside of historical events, because so much of the power relations and the micro decision making that went into an event is available in the archives in Ottawa for Japanese Canadians. And the Japanese Canadian archive is like a national treasure, which is disintegrating even as we're talking right now, because there's not enough money to reproduce it.
Well, you offer a very evocative and detailed and complex view of the redress movement in your book, Redress. But there is one moment that I find extremely interesting and endearing. You're just about to join the leadership of the movement. And just before you enter the scene and take your seat at the leadership table, you are eager to appear normal and be taken seriously. And what do? You go out and get a haircut. You get a sports jacket, a tie, a new pair of shoes, only to find out when you show up that you are the one who is overdressed. So I find that kind of interesting, this redress, being overdressed, reading and misreading. And I would like to hear you talk a bit or remember, give us a sense of how you entered that movement and how by that time you were already a poet, you were an academic, you had your own family life. How did the redress movement inflect your sense of subjectivity? How did it change how did you negotiate all the demands it made on your life and the community?
The short story is that there was a crisis in the community. It's in 1983, in the summer of 1983, and a redress committee in Toronto was making moves to make a deal with the federal government that year to accept a redress agreement based upon acknowledgement of injustices and a $5 million community fund.
But no individual compensation.
No individual compensation. And this was going ahead, and this was at the same time that the Japanese Canadian community had not even begun to discuss redress in any depth. That would go on from 1983 to 1988. So this was early on, and the community organization in Vancouver was really worried. They wanted to stop this guy from going ahead. And so they phoned me up and they said, would you represent us? I was a part of a smaller radical group, and we were trying to get redress in different means. But we were not representative of the community, and they phoned me up and said, well, I said, what do you want me to do? And they said, just stop him. It's like a mandate. Don't let him, we want you to try to stop him from making a deal with the government. And that was a Prince Hotel Labor Day weekend in 1983 where the community had its first crisis. And the leadership of the redress movement resigned after that meeting, and we voted that committee down, the National Council. But I was really worried because up until that point, I was just a long-haired guy who was in literature. And my community I don't think they thought too much of me, whoever knew of me, but in Winnipeg they knew me. And so I decided to redress myself. And I felt like a fool when I got there, and everybody was so casual. Nobody had a suit and tie on or anything like that. I was the only one dressed up, and they were going, what the heck? One of his best friends, Harold says to me, what the heck are you doing here?
Looking like this.
Looking like this. So that was my first introduction to the community politics.
But to me, that's interesting because the notion of community evokes a sense of homogeneity, solidarity, but it's always also a site of conflict.
Yeah.
And the Japanese-Canadian community is not the only community you've been involved in. You have also been a major player, an activist in the writing community. And for example, this is the 20th anniversary of the Writing Through Race conference that took place here in 1994. Actually, Roy, Larissa Lai, and I are planning a conference at the University of Toronto, a one-day event, and you're all invited, March 7th, to revisit Writing Through Race, see what it accomplished then, what has happened in the interim. But that, to me, in the context of what you've been saying so far, Roy, situates you in a different kind of community. And so I would like to hear you reflect on the notion of community, whether your sense of community, especially, say, in the 90s, of writers of color or Japanese Canadians who had just achieved such a major redress movement, whether community has changed in the way it signifies or whether the pressures on different communities and constituencies today are different.
I don't know. The Japanese Canadian community, to my mind, has always tended towards the conservative side. They've always been afraid of ruffling feathers. They've always been afraid of speaking out. And during the redress movement, a lot of people, Japanese Canadians, especially of my parents' generation, really moved out into the public domain and really took on the issue in a way that totally amazed me. But after the movement was over, community leadership was replaced again by more conservative leadership. Now, they're not bad people, and they keep the flame going, and there's a certain kind of reification of Japanese Canadianness that's being kept alive. But I have been more distant from these communities. And the Writing Through Race event came out of a lot of coalition building that a lot of people in this room know all about. From the late 70s, early 80s on to into the 90s, various cultural communities, minority communities especially, engaged in a lot of resistance work and a lot of organizing of conferences that brought to the front the whole racialization process in Canada. The 80s was a volatile period for cultural politics. And a lot of friendships amongst writers and artists was made and forged, and filmmakers and so on. There was a large collective sense that we were engaged in a cultural movement that was important. And Writing Through Race was one part of that movement. It was much larger than that.
Yeah, yeah.
But interestingly, Writing Through Race is 1994, and there was all the controversy around it, and the funding was cut, and there was fundraising, and people gave money, and the conference went on, and was a beautiful success, I suppose, for people who were actually enjoying it. Those of us who were organizing it, Larissa and I know, were behind the scenes. We were going, oh my God, we couldn't sleep. We were just putting out fires just everywhere, and people. But you know what? The writers were saying, "What a great party!" And apparently it was great parties on the beach too that I never got to. Some of the workers who disappeared for 2 days came back and said, "This was a great conference." I said, "Yeah, but what about the revolution?" Too late. We're having a good time as a party. A lot of relationships were made, and so on, and that went on. And writers became writers, and books were published, and so on. But almost the day after Writing to Race, you could sit around Vancouver and hear total silence. Nobody gave a damn about Writing to Race in the media after it was over. They were gone elsewhere. Before it, Canada was falling apart. All the sacred liberal values were collapsing. The country was being taken over by these minority writers, and they're flaunting their power, and on and on and on. And then the day after it was over, they went off somewhere else, and their lovely Canada went on and reproduced its own power relations, on and on to this day. But identity politics sort of died around 1994. And cultural globalization became much more immediate. And even writers of color who were previous to 1994 may have been working within a national Canadian context and were thinking of becoming Canadian writers, began to rethink themselves as globalized writer and post-colonial theory.
Yeah, and that's very evident in your own work too, because from around that time, especially with this wonderful essay you wrote about Roy Kyoka's writing, you start paying more attention, well, as much attention to the local, but it is a local that embodies the there, and subjectivities are inflected by global flow. Right. So you shift your focus from the kind of exclusively dealing or writing about the national imaginary to looking at a global.
That was a project of surrender.
Yeah.
I reached a crisis point myself, and my family, my wife and I and 2 kids, we went away for a week to think about, what the hell was that? What does it mean? And so I couldn't make sense of it at that time. I realized that, okay, the world is actually shifting, and the national frameworks had become much more porous, and the nation was really important to me. But I decided to take on the project of trying to understand cultural globalization more. So I started traveling and went to Germany, Taiwan, and went to Japan, Australia, the United States, and took part in conferences and wrote poems based upon those experiences, and that became Surrender.
There's another thing that happens in your writing or creative career around that time, and that is that you begin to work as an editor in a much more kind of focused way. And I'd like to hear from you how you think of editing, what editing entails as a cultural practice, as a creative practice, because you founded and edited a very important literary and critical magazine Line that now exists under a slightly different name, West Coast Line. You edited poetry collections, you edited essays, you edited critical collections, poetics, so books by Roy Kyoka posthumously, and so on and so forth. So obviously editing is very important to you, and to me somehow seems to be a different way in which you link to different kinds of communities or writers. So can you talk a bit about that?
I always thought of editing as a particular kind of vortex. Thinking of Pound's vorticism, this idea of editing as a nexus, as a kind of a matrix, and where all these different creative flows are coming in and through and across, and the editor is a kind of a composer, a choreographer, sees all the crisscross and the patterns and so on, sees all these things going on, and doesn't try to bring it into a coherent sense, but wants to create a framework through which this kind of commotion, this chaos, this noise of creative writing can enter into a readership, become a vehicle for that kind of thing. And I actually, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a publisher. I couldn't get it together. I went out when I was a grad student at UBC. I went out to try to buy an A.B. Dick press. I thought I'm going to publish my own books, and I realized I didn't have any place to put it. And I had no money for ink, paper. And the text might have been there, so I never got that off the ground. But editing seemed the next best thing. And I was fortunate to teach at SFU and be able to start that creative writing journal Line, which, by the way, went into West Coast Line, but under Jeff Dirkson's editorship, has gone back to Line. Yay!
Yay. In one of your most recent critical essays called Belief as / in Methodology, you call for a different kind of method, a method you call a creative critical reading practice. I find interesting that instead of thinking vis-a-vis creative and the critical, you bring the two together. And I'd like to hear you talk a bit more about that.
It goes back to that bifurcated self that I was talking about, the constructed one and the creative one. And those two poles, the creative and the critical, have gone hand in hand with me for as long as I can remember. And I've tried to write criticism that has creative elements in it, and write. I've got into a lot of trouble. Write poetry with critical elements. That's often a no-no in Canada.
But in your first collection of essays, Broken Entries, one of the interesting things beyond you're articulating the notion of agency and the formation of Asian Canadian writing, you also deconstruct substantially and very effectively the form of the essay by using text boxes, by inserting your own narrative, private narrative, familial narrative. And so that, from the very first book about Canadian literature, because interestingly enough, your book about William Carlos Williams, with its emphasis on pre-poetics, also shows a desire to go beyond inherited forms and molds, right?
Yeah, I was fascinated by Williams because he wrote Cora using what he calls his improvisational method, and it became a procedural form for him, procedural means for him throughout his own life, and he discovered it there. And improvisation has always been important for me as a form, that you make do with whatever is at hand, and form comes out of the process of creating the work, and the form is the extension of that process. So there's no form prior to the enactment of the process. And in the enactment of the process, you have to negotiate all the various conditions that are operative at any given time in any language structure.
Another interesting shift in your recent work is your growing interest or writing more in a more direct way about Indigenous writing and Indigenous issues, and following what's been happening with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So I wonder whether you want to talk a bit about that, how your writing and your thinking and how you situate yourself in your community is broadening up by engaging with those issues from the perspective of ethics, from the perspective of finding a different critical language.
Yeah. Well, reconciliation in and around Aboriginal issues is an enormous issue, and we need to be very careful about how we dialogue with that issue, how we construct a relationship to it, how we even attempt to represent its complexity in any way. And one of the greatest delights for me in the last 4 or 5 years is the emergence of a particular kind of Aboriginal scholarship and critical thought that is to my mind still in process and will probably take another decade to fully begin to realize the historical roots of that way of thinking. And that's going to transform us. But for the rest of us, we need to really respect the whole process and educate ourselves in and around what we could do to make much more visible the kind of atrocities that Aboriginal communities have endured and faced for 150 years. You know. Like today, I was just today in the Vancouver Sun, there was a one-page piece by Stephen Harper on John A. Macdonald. It's a weird piece to open up and saying, John A. Macdonald, Stephen Harper. You don't think of the Prime Minister as an essayist. I read it really quickly because I had to prepare to come here. But he doesn't mention that it was on John A. Macdonald's watch that the residential school system was built and constructed. So we still have this kind of history of the settler history being reified, and this other history being covered over and made invisible. So I'm trying myself in the paper I'm writing right now. I'm trying to bring redress for Japanese Canadians together with reconciliation to see what they have to offer, what redress could offer reconciliation as a way of thinking. And I haven't drawn many conclusions yet, but I'm hoping to develop this piece into a larger essay and perhaps a collection of essays.
That's interesting because I remember you being invited to talk about the redress of the Japanese Canadians at a meeting of Korean Japanese in Tokyo. So the redress movement is not only valuable and extremely significant vis-a-vis the Japanese Canadian community, but also as a model, as the beginning of a narrative of redress in general. And so how do you see it working as a paradigm or as a series of discursive strategies that can be modified or employed elsewhere?
Well, we obviously need to develop very comprehensive critical methodologies to begin to assess any given representation of reconciliation in any given form, documentary form, essay form, historical form, narrative form. And it needs to be very, very comprehensive. We need to see ourselves as a part of the particular kind of problematic of defining or articulating what it might mean as the future unfolds. So it's a lengthy process.
Yes, for sure. And to go back to your poetry, earlier we talked about your call for a creative and critical writing practice as a new method, and the way you articulate that argument in your essay evokes a certain kind of ethos, or more specifically, actually ethics. So, is this something that you see as being part of your role as a poet? Always engaging with or kind of situating yourself in terms of engaging with ethical questions, or what constitutes the ethical?
Yeah, I'm much more it's the internment. Internment. If the internment had produced an ethics to deal with the treatment of Japanese Canadians, it would not have done the government could not have done what it did to Japanese Canadians. Ethics to me is really important. It's because in the doing is that we produce our relationships. Anything that is not enacted and put into process doesn't have that much value to me. That's why moral systems are not important to me as ethical relationships and ethical modes of behavior. And the idea of justice is critiqued from all the angles these days. But my fundamental kind of feeling is that life wants to produce life. People don't go out to kill life. To inflict damage on others, to prevent others from realizing their fullest creative potential. Life reproduces life. And all living systems tend towards a notion of justice and seek a notion of justice. That's my feeling. Even the cells in our own body are moving towards a reproduction of justice. It's like they're trying to save your organism, even when you fill it with garbage and all kinds of poisons. The physical system fights back. It tries to deal with those nasty ingredients and tries to transform them into creative modes of keeping the organism alive.
And so the creative and the critical are also embodied.
Yeah.
I would like to thank you all for attending and for your questions, and I want to thank especially Miki for taking the time to talk about his writing and his.
I feel I haven't been articulate.
Well, then we can do it again.
Yeah.
Start all over again. Thank you very much, Roy.
Yeah, thanks.